Tilea's Troubles, Part 13. The Little Waagh, a Battle Report. Summer, 2401, 2 miles west of Pavisano, in southern Tilea. The day before.
We can do it ourselves, boss. Smash 'em good and proper. Us gobs don't need no orcs when we got a mob this size.
All the goblins nodded or grunted their agreement to Booglebor's optimistic appraisal, except for big boss Germless. He didn't look convinced at all.
We ain't so big as you think, Boog, said Germless. Put it like this. If Khurnag's big mob is a mountain, then we're nothing more than a rat's dropping.
Germless could see anger on some faces, fear on others. The first probably thought he was insulting them, by implying they were not fit for a fight. The latter would be thinking that little bit further, and realising that if Germless commanded them to run, then Warlord Khurnag would make them pay for their cowardice. Let them be afraid, thought Germless, but not about the Orc Warlord's punishment.
Still, he said, orders is orders. We have to fight, because we was told to mess up anyone trying to sneak up on Khurnag from behind. That don't mean we have to win. Just take a few of them down with us.
Booglebor snorted derisively.
Great speech, boss.
Germless looked back at him, his scowling mouth revealing blooded gums and fangs, and then looked around at the gathered goblin bosses. Aye, well, he said, I ain't no poet. Look, all of you, keep what I said between you lot and me, otherwise I'll be having a different kind of word with you. Get the ragtags together, right now, and I mean all of 'em. You can tell 'em what you like, whatever makes 'em happy. Just make sure they's ready to move as soon as Clanger rings his bell. The fight. As forces went, the little Waagh looked impressive enough, if you were purblind, that is, standing some distance away with the sun in your eyes. It was at least big in numbers and sported several war machines, basically whichever ones happened to have grease enough on their axles to be dragged out of the town. Germless rode a chariot, adorned with a mucky brown banner painted with what an old goblin shaman had told him was a protectively magical emblem. He was on the left of the battle line, with the 2 other chariots clattering beside his. 2 bands of wolf riders came up on the right flank, with a pump wagon to their left, while the really big mobs, carrying short bows and pikes, took to the centre, with a couple of spear chuckers between them. On the very far left, beside Germless's 3 chariots, another pumper trundled forwards. A portly old veteran called Clanger led the pike. Of all the goblin mobs present, this was the only one that looked like it might really sting. Everyone knew gobbos with bows usually did a little more than annoy the foe, and pepper the ground with splintered shafts, and although wolves were mean enough mounts, their riders often let them down when it really came to it. The pike regiment, however, was a mobile forest of hafts, tipped with vicious iron barbs, and had a properly nasty look about it. Clanger himself had trained his lads in the pike's use, having served as a scout for a condottieri army in the Border Princes, and observed the Tilean pikemen drilling. All the goblins in the Little Waagh were agreed the pike mob was their hardest hitter. The trouble was, the enemy had pikes too, and they were longer, more ordered, and gleamed that little bit sharper. They also had guns, lots of guns, both big and small, demi-culverins, muskets, pistols. They had horses too, with armoured men on their backs. More than that, they had defences. Not only had they occupied the goblins' abandoned, rickety watchtower, they had shifted the stone ruins around to fashion up proper walls. Germless cursed when he saw the enemy's true disposition. His patently useless outriders had reported none of this, merely saying the enemy marched to the beat of drums and dressed in matching colours. They had not lied, but they had hardly gone out of their way to impart the important stuff. There were more enemy horsemen on the field than goblin wolf riders, which did not bode well at all, considering that outnumbering the enemy was usually the only thing gobbos had going for them. One band of horsemen were led by a man with brighter armour than the rest, sporting an orange sash and riding a grey mount. Germless decided the brightly coloured sash most likely signalled the man's authority, Indeed, he was probably the enemy's war boss. Squinting, Germless shielded the sun from his eyes and studied the man. He seemed to be in conversation with the fellow next to him. Both were clutching shiny goblets from which they sipped, as if the ensuing battle were to be nothing more than a sporting hunt. Germless fumed. He would like to take that goblet and stuff it down the man's throat. Here he was, very likely about to die because he was more afraid of Khurnag than these men, while they supped wine as if they were on a dainty picnic. Looking along the lines, Germless strained his eyes to learn whatever else he could. The foe's bronze-barrelled field pieces gleamed, while their orderly soldiers manned the defences. It was plainly obvious the foe was just going to wait for him and his goblins to advance. Behind the defenders he could make out their camp, umpteen mules laden with supplies, which meant they no doubt had plenty of the noisome black powder that fuelled their guns. Was nothing going to go his way today? A creaking and clattering sound broke his miserable reverie, and he glanced to his left to see the pump wagon picking up its pace, despite the fact that he had not given any signals yet. "Bugger it," he swore, and lifted his hand to give the signal anyway. Might as well see the day through. Maybe the enemy's powder was wet. Maybe their men were untrained youths. Maybe Khurnag would forgive him if he ran away after the first volley. Maybe the snotlings on the pump wagon were proofed against cannonballs. But the only thing snotlings were proofed against was common sense. As the main body shuffled about in an only partly successful attempt to sort their ranks and files, far to the right the two bands of wolf riders separated to travel either side of the hovel before them, while bold as brass one of the enemy's horse regiments trotted forwards as if the goblin pikes and chariots weren't even there, clutching pistols in their raised hands in a gesture at one at the same time both threatening and strangely delicate. The flag mounted on Germless's chariot snapped in a sudden gust of wind, making Germless wince. He turned to his driver and snarled, "Go on then." All the enemy's riders had begun moving up, their knights staying together to round the hovel and thus counter the wolf riders' surprisingly bold advance. Then, before a single foot-slogging goblin had begun to march, a magical blast of burning energy came spurting out of the upper reaches of the tower, proving the enemy had brought at least one wizard. The enchanted flames wreathed the pump wagon nearest to the chariots, spewing umpteen squealing snotlings from it, some trailing smoke as they staggered about in agony, two bursting like gooseberries roasting on a griddle. It was, even for goblins who usually derive cruel amusement from such sights, a horribly dismaying start to the battle. Both the chariots beside Germless's turned and fled, leaving Germless alone out on the flank, apart from the rock thrower, the crew of which had apparently failed to notice the pump wagon's awful demise due to a heated squabble over whose turn it was to pull the lever and so launch the first boulder. Then came the rolling thunder of the enemy's guns, opening with a ripple of staggered cracks, melding into a roaring blast, punctuated by the even louder retorts of the cannons. So much lead and iron was hurled into the wolf riders that, as the sound faded to transform into a ringing in the gunners' ears, only two riders remained, Booglebore and his standard-bearer. Booglebore turned to look at his last warrior with a mad grin.
"Oh, good. You still got the flag, then?"
he said, one eye twitching. He was very much regretting his bold words of earlier in the day. The goblin standard-bearer, hunched and cowering behind his heavy round shield, the pole of the wolf pack's flag tucked between his shield and his shoulder, was stunned by what had just happened. Nevertheless, he nodded.
"That's great,"
said Booglebore, his sarcastic tone not in the least bit subtle.
"It'll be blooming useful now there's no flipping pack left to follow it."
The goblin grimaced foolishly, then pointed forwards with his hooked blade.
"Boss, look," he squeaked. "We's gobbed."
Booglebore laughed maniacally.
"Oh, you noticed? Clever git."
Quickly balancing the range of almost certainly suicidal options available to him, he chose the only one he thought might actually have a chance of keeping him alive. Spurring his shaggy wolf and twisting its head with his reins, he shouted, "Follow me!" and sped off around the knight's flank. As he did so, the other wolf pack came around the hovel towards the knight's rear. Germless was not in the mood to sneak about looking for the enemy's rear, and drove his chariot hard and fast at the pistol-bearing riders ahead of him. They simply trotted away, as if he were a mild annoyance or a bad smell they were more than happy to keep their distance from. Meanwhile, the rest of Germless's little Waagh marched and shuffled while sending magic, arrows and bolts at the foe. Nothing at all seemed to come of their efforts. The enemy seemed entirely unharmed, not even agitated. Beside the goblin archers, the second pump wagon trundled along, powered by the frantic pumping of two snotlings named Earwig and Mudbelly. The machine was a surprisingly robust design, almost sleek in its shape, sporting a very vicious set of spiky rollers and blades powered by the same set of pumping bars that propelled it.
"Faster!" ordered Mudbelly. "Faster and faster!"
Earwig grunted acknowledgement and pumped harder than he had ever done. The bar lifted him off the floor on the upstrokes.
"It's good! That's good!" shouted Mudbelly.
Earwig grinned, sweat dripping from the end of his sharp nose, while spittle and snot conjoined to congeal upon his lips. In between grunts he issued giggles and squeaks. At the very same moment, across the space that still divided the two forces, an artillery officer of the VMC was pointing at a spot a little ahead of the pump wagon with his short sword. The piece he commanded, a demi-culverin by the Marienburg reckoning, had the company's colours of blue and orange prettily painted on its wheels, while its crew, veteran soldiers of several campaigns, wore matching red coats. The piece's gunner and matrosses lifted the rear of the gun and swung it around to aim exactly where the officer had indicated. Within moments the burning match had been applied, the gun had fired, and 9 pound of iron shot bounced through the speeding snotling contraption, tearing the pumping mechanism right out, along with Earwig, who failed to let go of the bars even as they were violently yanked away, while one of the snapped chains swung violently around to cut Mudbelly in two. The guttered wagon slowed to a halt. Weeks later, one goblin archer, one of the very few to survive the battle, would swear that Earwig was still pumping even as he flew through the air, leaving a spattering trail of blood and snot behind him. It was not a cannonball that did for Big Boss Germless, but more magic. Once again magical fire lashed out from the eyes of the wizard atop the tower to sear the fur off the two wolves drawing Germless's chariot. Howling pathetically, they fell to the ground in writhing agony, tipping the chariot over and throwing Germless out. He picked himself up and limped over to a little clump of bushes. There he stopped, and with his unsheathed blade across his mailed shoulder, he glowered helplessly at the foe. Nothing unexpected had happened. In fact, Germless was mildly surprised still to be alive, and very much relieved that he might actually be so tomorrow too. It was not anger at his misfortune that filled him, but malice towards the foe. Let them have their pathetic victory, he fumed. Wait till they meet the big Waagh. Then they'll find out quick enough what greenskins can do. Killing gobbos, snots and scraggy wolves is one thing, but orcs, boars and wyverns is another. He did not run, but rather waited and watched the fight some more. If he was going to face Khurnag, he would at least give the most accurate report he could of the foe. Khurnag was mighty and cruel, but he was no fool. He would know from Germless's report that a ragtag, petty force of goblins, put together with only a bit of extra looting in mind, was no match for this kind of foe. But Khurnag could also learn of the foe's exact composition, all the better to plan how exactly he would tear them to pieces. In the centre of the field, and quite possibly still entirely ignorant of the hopelessness of their situation, the two main regiments of goblins began to advance a little quicker. Perhaps it was sheer numbers that so clouded their judgment, or their memories of victories serving as merely one small part of Khurnag's great Waagh. Whatever the cause, they advanced directly towards the muzzles of the enemy's massed guns. The VMC's knights had formed in a most professional manner and now trotted towards the last surviving wolf pack. Just as they arrived, with the goblins bemused as to why their heavily armoured foe was not charging, they unleashed a hail of pistol balls to fell almost half of the greenskins. More than a little dismayed that the foe could do so much harm against them without even unsheathing their blades, The surviving goblins turned and fled the field for good. Once again, the cuirassiers simply reformed, turned, and set off back towards the centre of the field. The pike goblins were now beginning to receive casualties as the foe stopped shooting at pump wagons and wolf packs and instead turned their attention on the sluggardly brace of regiments in the midst of the otherwise shattered goblin line. The cuirassiers charged headlong into the shortbows, the counter-shot of arrows bouncing from the steel plates of their lobster-like armour, which left the pike goblins all alone in the advance towards the enemy defences. Cannons, muskets and pistols now all blasted almost as one and tore the pike goblins apart. What few remained fled away pell-mell. From atop a little mound of rocks, Germless watched them. Suddenly his attention was caught by the blaring of hunting horns to his right, and he turned to witness the short-bow goblins being trodden under the hooves of the foe's heavy horses as they too inevitably ran. Satisfied that there was no more to see, and happy in the knowledge that he was now merely one greenskin amongst the many pouring from the field, Germless hopped down from the rocks to join the general flight. Thus ended the battle, which the VMC went on to describe as their glorious victory against a foul horde serving dark gods.